So I grew up listening to jazz. In particular, my family really loved to listen to like big band music. And one of the artists that I absolutely loved growing up was named Ella Fitzgerald. Ella Fitzgerald had a lot of amazing songs, but one of the ones that I loved was a duet that she did with Louis Armstrong. And the name of the jazz standard was called Potato Potato or something like that. So this is the point where I would cut to a video of them performing it together on stage, but long story short, my technology situation is not great at the moment. So instead, check out this link if you want to see it. Okay, why do I bring up Potato Potato? First of all, it's a banger. You should love it. Second of all, because it sort of has a message of subjectivity, right? Ella Fitzgerald says, I say potato, and then Louis Armstrong says potato, right? And the whole thing is kind of about how, in relationships you can oftentimes have differences in opinion and everything, but, ultimately you come together. And that brings us to our lesson today. In this video, what we're going to look at is some of the debates that happened within the professional academic history community around the late 19th and early 20th century. And the point is to show that after the kind of consensus around the professionalization of history that happened in Germany and lots of other places in the late 19th century, there were lots of professional historians who sort of pushed back, who critiqued the kind of science of history that Ranke and others promoted. So that's what we're going to look at in this video. All right, let's get going. Okay, we're going to explore this subject really in two ways. The first, we're going to kind of review what we mean by the science of history, where that came from and what it kind of resulted in. And then second, we're going to look at some of the critiques that other professional historians brought to that whole kind of world of the science of history. All right, first things first, let's remind ourselves, what is the science of history? All right, let's remind ourselves, what do we mean by the science of history? Well, this is a development that happened in the late 19th century within the kind of professionalization of history movement, the movement to sort of professionalize history. And the idea here was that history didn't have its own kind of disciplinary approach to its subject. So practitioners in the 19th century thought, well, what if we sort of invented an approach to the past, right? And turn this into a science just like how the physical sciences exist, right? We methodize it and make it the same sort of approach to understanding our phenomenon as, physicists and chemists have. So what they did is adopt the scientific method, in essence, right? They tried to apply the scientific method to the past. So how did they do this? Well, first, they really structured their inquiries into the past around questions. This is kind of different from a lot of historical writing before this, where the point of telling stories about the past was to tell stories, right? Was to just talk about stories that were important in some way. Scientific historians instead wanted to try to use the past to answer questions. They started first with a question about the past, the how and why of things happen. And then they moved on from there to set up essentially an experiment. And they did their experiments with, and this was really important for scientific historians of the late 19th century, they did it with original materials. The idea here was that in order to do an experiment on the past, you need to get material from that past, or at least as close to that past as possible. So what this meant was not only using primary sources, yes, but using primary sources in their kind of original form. And that usually was through the work of archives, right? Going into the archives, pulling out the original materials in their dusty, broken, kind of nasty forms. Then the next step was to analyze that data, right? Analyze the materials that they were doing their experiment on. And here, the practitioners of the science of history really kind of approached it in what we might call a sort of Rankian way. The idea here was that they were trying to be as objective as possible. So in order to analyze their data objectively, they just needed to say what the sources said. The idea was not to invent any sort of other narratives or interpretations. Instead, stick to exactly what the sources say, and that will tell you what the past was. Again, the phrase that we can sort of remember here from Ranke is wie es eigentlich gewesen, right? Say history needs to be, or the work of the historian needs to be, to say what actually happened. Finally, they would write these histories, but they wrote them in a kind of mode of objectivity. The whole idea here is that if you make the study of the past scientific, then you will come up with objective results, right? You will find the sort of objective truth of the past. So they believed, right, that what they were doing in sort of systematizing it this way was coming up with a past that was sort of pristine, right? That was true, that was objective. And they wrote about it objectively. They maintained a kind of commitment to writing history in a sort of objective lens. And we can remember that the main guy at the center of this movement, not the only guy by any stretch of the imagination, but the person who gets sort of associated most closely with this movement of scientific history and professionalizing history along these lines, was Leopold von Ranke. And Ranke's commitment to making sort of history into a science was to do a few things. First, he wanted to achieve a history that was truthful. This is the idea of a sort of objective history. He and lots of other professional historians who sort of adopted this method thought, what's the way that we can do this the best, right? How can we achieve the true sort of understanding of the past? Well, the science of history for them was a way to kind of ensure the truthfulness of their historical accounts. Second, the whole idea that they sort of adopted around this was historicist, right? They believed in the kind of historicist approach to the past, which was to understand the past for its particularity, not as a way to kind of create large universal narratives about humanity or anything like that. Historicists did this because they were uncomfortable with the way that previous historians had used the past to sort of come up with moral lessons, right? Or ways to live your life. This was a common refrain in a lot of like pre-modern historical writing and really historical writing all the way up through the 19th century. You study the past to learn lessons, right? Lessons that you either don't want to repeat or lessons that you do want to replicate. Well, Ranke and the sort of scientists of history, if we want to call them that, were sort of pushing in the opposite direction to say, no, that's not the right way to understand the past. Instead, we need to understand the past as a separate time, a separate place, separate people, not the same as us. Thus, what they did has really very little bearing on what we should do or can do today. Ranke's commitment was to demoralizing the past. And that was sort of the approach that most people who adopted the kind of scientific history approach used. Third, the effort to sort of create this science of history was, as I said before, an effort to try to systematize the discipline of history. Historians have been practicing their craft in lots of different ways. Yes, there were sort of commonalities and shared ideas about approaching the past, but really, as you've seen in all these videos, historians have been doing it really differently for a very, very long time. Ranke and his colleagues thought, well, this shouldn't be, right? We should define what it is to do history the right way. And that means kind of systematizing how you approach the past. And finally, it was towards the effort of creating institutions that would kind of demarcate the space for professional historians that all of this happened, right? You create a science of history because that becomes the kind of guiding principle for historical associations, for determining if a person should be a professor of history at a university, right? This is the way that these institutions of history, of professional history, sort of achieve their mission statements in a way, right? You have to practice history in this way to be a part of this institution. All right, so now the question is, why would anyone be upset with this approach to history? Now we're going to look at some of the critiques that arose within the professional historical community about this kind of approach to the past. All right, so what's so problematic about this approach to the past, right? The scientific kind of history of Ronca and his disciples. Well, lots of people thought it was a great idea. That's why it became the kind of basis for historical work in professional history for a very, very long time, since the 19th century, and in many ways all the way till today. But some professional historians pushed back, and they pushed back for a few different reasons. I'm going to give you three main reasons that professional historians push back on the kind of scientific approach to history. The first was what we might call the idealist critique. Idealist historians were historians largely in the United States and Britain who kind of identified themselves in this particular way as sort of critics of Ronca and the Ronchian approach to the past. And the critique really had to do with a kind of fundamental philosophical understanding about the past. You see, idealist historians basically maintained that there was no such thing as facts that you could uncover of the past, right? The past doesn't actually exist in the present day. There are relics of the past that we can use to sort of understand the past in different ways, but a pure kind of pristine fact that you can just sort of uncover and experiment with like a scientist is not true, right? Idealist historians essentially said that it's true, right? While the past was reality, nevertheless, it only exists in the present through the mind of the historian. One example of this idealist critique, or idealist historians, was Carl Becker, who was a professor in history in the United States at Cornell University for a while, and some other institutions too, I think Yale. And here's a kind of quote from Becker that illustrates this sort of idealist critique. Becker said, "The facts of history do not exist for any historian till he creates them." Now, this might sound sort of crazy to you. You might think, no, things happened in the past. That was real, whether you say they were real or not. Yes, that's true, idealist historians would say, but they would say, but we don't know about them until one of us talks about it, right? Until you come up with the idea to uncover this past, that past doesn't exist for present-day readers or students or anything like that. This kind of goes against the grain of scientific history, of the idea of writing an objective history that just says what actually happened, right, as Ronca said. Instead, idealist historians said, no, we have to understand that historians themselves play a role in uncovering the past, and that makes history, at least to some small degree, subjective. Another critique that came out of the professional historical community was what I call here the pragmatic critique. And really this has to do with the debate of why we do history at all, right? What's the purpose of history? Pragmatic historians essentially criticize the kind of historicist notion of lots of scientific historians. What they essentially said is historicism is a kind of unreasonable approach to history in the sense that it alienates history from present-day readers and present-day students of the past. For pragmatic historians, what they sort of felt is that history has to be relevant to today. You have to write histories that have some impact on how we live our lives or what we think or what we believe or our own experiences. If history is just about understanding a sort of alien past for the sake of understanding this alien past, well, then it loses its value in some ways. An example of this kind of critique comes from the English historian George Macaulay Trevelyan. Here's what Trevelyan said. "The root questions can be put in these terms. Ought history be merely the accumulation of facts about the past? Or ought it also be the interpretation of facts about the past? Or ought it to be not merely the accumulation and interpretation of facts, but also the exposition of these facts and opinions in their full emotional and intellectual value to a wide public by the difficult art of literature?" He goes on later to say, "To read sustained and magnificent historical narrative educates the mind and the character." And what Trevelyan really means here is he says that the work of the historian shouldn't just be about uncovering facts about the past or even just interpreting those facts to understand why something happened in the past. Instead, history needs to be about making the past have a difference in the lives of people in the present. For him, history largely served the role of inspiration, telling great stories that are truthful and true and accurate about the past would inspire people in the present to imagine their own present and their own futures. A final critique came from what we might call scientific historians in their own right. People who largely bought the basic narrative about approaching the past in a scientific way and sort of using the scientific method to understand what happened in the past. But they started to push back on Ranke and some of the people who approached scientific history in the way I explained before by questioning whether their histories were actually scientific at all. The critique was essentially this. Most scientific historians, like Ranke and his disciples, in order to focus on original materials, would go to basically state archives and pull out documents there. Well, what this meant is that the histories that they wrote were largely sort of political, diplomatic histories, sometimes military histories too. And some professional historians looked at that and went, yes, you might be approaching things scientifically, but you have not understood the whole of the past in this approach. To be scientific, you have to test more than just the writings and experiences of Western political elites. Critiques of this sort came from all over the globe. Professional historians throughout the world kind of leveled this critique on lots of scientific historians, especially back in Germany and in England and places like that. We can think, for example, of the Annales school in France as one of these critiques. Annales historians said, yes, scientific approach to the past is great, but if you just go into diplomatic archives and talk about, political leaders, then you have missed the histories of the vast majority of the world. Nationalist historians also sort of approached this or critiqued scientific history in this way. For example, nationalist historians in early 20th century China often brought the critique that Ranke and his kind of school of scientific historians were, yes, writing kind of good, solid scientific histories of the past, but they weren't using the government documents from places like the Qing Empire, right? And how can we really understand the past in any sort of conclusive way without expanding our vision, at least beyond the archives of German political states? Another scientific historian who leveled this kind of critique on Ranke and other scientific historians in the world at that moment was W.B. Du Bois. Du Bois was specifically interested in writing the history of Black Americans and the Black American community. And he saw the approach that so many scientific historians in universities throughout the United States and really throughout the world as essentially ignoring a large swath of the population in the U.S. Here's what Du Bois writes. I write in a field devastated by passion and belief. Naturally, as a Black American, I cannot do this writing without believing in the essential humanity of Black Americans, in their ability to be educated, to do the work of the modern world, to take their place as equal citizens with others. But two, as a student of science, I want to be fair, objective, and judicial, to let no searing of the memory by intolerable insult and cruelty make me fail to sympathize with human frailties and contradiction in the eternal paradox of good and evil. But armed and warned by all this, and fortified by long study of the facts, I stand at the end of this writing literally aghast at what American historians have done to this field. So what Du Bois is essentially saying in these quotes is that he, too, is a scientific historian, right? A person who approached the past in the same way that Ranke and many others. Du Bois got his PhD in an American university. He was trained in these Rankean methods. But he said he was also horrified by the way that these types of historians wrote their histories, because largely what they did when they wrote histories of the United States is they wrote histories of the United States that completely erased and completely ignored the experiences of Black Americans throughout American history. And this critique for Du Bois was really powerful because he turned essentially the whole objective narrative of scientific history on its head. He said, you're not doing scientific history, in fact, right? By self-selecting the people that you care about and the people that you'll focus on, you are actually showing your subjective interests. You're being a bad scientist. Du Bois tried to correct this narrative by writing the histories of people who had been ignored. Okay, what have we learned? Well, we've learned that even though the professionalization of history in the late 19th century happened around this idea of creating a kind of science of history, right? A scientific approach to the past, that idea wasn't necessarily accepted by all professional historians. Lots of historians that were trained in universities, who got PhDs in history, who worked in other universities or historical associations, they wanted to approach the past in a different way. So this lesson sort of illustrates that, again, the varieties of history have been around for a very long time. History has not been practiced in exactly the same way for all time. Second, it's in this period where we start to see kind of the varieties of history like we talked about before, the big five and some of these other sort of subfields of history emerge in a much more kind of crystallized and a much more concrete way. This is all happening within the professional academic community, and people start to identify themselves as a different type of historian in this period. This is particularly true with social history. There are lots of historians who start to identify themselves as social historians specifically in this period. So what we saw before in previous eras where social history kind of showed up in sort of subtle ways in people's historical writings, now we see professional historians saying, no, this is the way I approach the past, this is what I look at, and this is how I do it. And this situation produces a kind of fracturing, in a way, of the historical community. What we're going to see in the next video is this fracturing go wild. We're going to see the historical profession, the professional academic community of history, really split apart into lots of different sort of splintering subfields and specialties. But that's the story for next time. Until then, good job. See you in class.